Hello, Dr. Thomas Spain here, and in this week's episode of Curator with a Camera we are going transatlantic with Henry Oakley. This locomotive was built for the Great Northern Railway. The Great Northern operated a main line linking King's Cross in London to just beyond Doncaster, as well as routes into Lincolnshire, Staffordshire and as far north as Keighley. The railway company operated an intensive suburban and semi-fast passenger service along with express passenger trains to the north. By the 1890s, passenger trains were getting beyond the capabilities of the locomotives of Patrick Stirling, the Great Northern Railway's locomotive superintendent. Stirling retired in 1895 and was replaced by Henry Hisgett, who was alive to the need for a large engine policy to get more power out of the locomotives. The problem was the track wouldn't support the weight of heavier locomotives, and so the only way of actually getting a heavier locomotive on the track of the era was to actually increase the length of the locomotive and spread the weight over a greater area of the track. Higett's response was number 990, the first 442 Atlantic locomotive to enter service on Britain's railways. The Atlantic concept emerged in the United States and was a progression of the 440 type of express passenger locomotive. Higett's Atlantics gained the nickname Klondike, and this is because they were authorised in February 1897, which coincided with the gold rush of the Klondike region of Canada. Because it was the big news of the era, it was what the workforce at Doncaster nicknamed the locomotive, and it stuck. By 1900, the decision was made to actually give this particular locomotive a name, and that name was Henry Oakley, who was the general manager of the Great Northern Railway. And between 1900 and 1903, another 21 of these locomotives were constructed for running up and down on the East Coast Main Line. Essentially, Henry Oakley is very much a prototype in every type of the word, in terms of the fact that they actually spent a good year or so on trials without any further examples of the class being built. So that's enough of the history. Let's have a look at Henry Oakley in detail. So follow me, please. Oh, and by the way, don't forget to like and subscribe. We like mixing things up a little bit on Curator with the Camera, and so we decided to sort of start our tour with the cab. And here it is. This is Henry Oakley's cab. So all the driver's controls are over there. And so essentially we can kind of start moving from right to left. So this contraption here is the vacuum brake control. You can actually see the train control vacuum pressure gauge, and it says LNER on it as well, so that's another example of the changes that happen to this locomotive. This contraption here is the reverser. It is a screw reverser, rather rudimentary looking. As originally built, Henry Oakley actually had a lever reverser, but when the production batch was built, the class was given a screw reverser, and so Henry Oakley was retrofitted with a screw reverser so that it standardised with the rest of the class. Moving slightly over, this is the driver's side injector of the locomotive. This helps admit the water into the boiler from the tender. This is the boiler water level gauge, a very important piece of equipment. You don't want to have too low a water level in the boiler, otherwise you'll end up melting the top of the firebox. This here is the double-handed regulator, which is like the throttle in your car. It admits steam to the cylinders, just like the throttle on your car admits fuel into the engine. And then moving further on, you have this fireman side boiler water gauge, which is great to have a duplicate of this particular safety device. And then you have the fireman side injector there, again admitting water into the boiler. And then you have the sanding control valve, again rather important for when you have your greasy rails and you need to get a bit more grip underneath your driving wheels, rather not having them spin around until hell freezes over, for example. And then down here you have the fire hold door. It's a bit of a letterbox type. And there's a little ratchet there that you can use to sort of keep it partially open to allow some air into the firebox to help regulate the burn. And then here you have a heat shield on the driver's side, which protects the driver's leg from heat from the fire. So the driver has a flip down seat, as you can see there. And then spinning round to the front of the tender, here we have the handbrake. That's the coal hole where the coal bunker is behind there. And again you can kind of see these little mushroom things in the distance there. They are actually there to allow the air to escape as the tender's filling with water. And now we're going to have a look at the front end of Henry Oakley. And of course it is a very different beast today to what emerged from Doncaster Works back in 1898. We have here the sort of the vacuum brake hose here. We also have the lamp brackets, so there's 4 of them. There's one on the left, there's one in the middle, one on the right, and then one up there on the smoke box door. And incidentally, the smoke box itself is very much different to the locomotive of 1898. When the rest of the production batch was built, they adopted this sort of outline, sort of almost flush with the edge of the smoke box wrapper there. Henry Oakley's own smoke boxes had rather more of a pronounced lip between the door and the actual wrapper. Another sort of telltale, if you will, of the hard life of this particular locomotive are the frames. And if you look very carefully, just take note of these 2 bolts here, and then remember those bolts and their location, and then we'll take you around to the other side, to the other set of frames, and you will notice that the right-hand side frame is a lot deeper than the left-hand side frame, and this is indicative of a repair. So this is a 2-cylinder locomotive. It would have been hammering up and down the East Coast main line. Inherently, 2-cylinder locomotives quite like to sort of waddle along the track, and so there's a lot of stress on the frames, and as a result you'd cut a piece out and replace them. And this is precisely what's happened here, and it wasn't unusual for only one side to be repaired at any one time, hence why there's a slight difference. It has 2 cylinders, and as you can see here there's a sleeve which contains the piston tail rod, and essentially what that does is helps to keep the piston in line within the cylinder and minimizing any wear at the base of the cylinder. Many steam locomotives in the collection actually only have the piston rod at this end connected to the crosshead, and essentially it's the thickness of the piston that helps to provide a bearing surface to keep it stable. So not all locomotives in the collection had these tail rods, and indeed this was actually a later addition to the locomotive, as it didn't have it as built. Another later addition to Henry Oakley, and indeed other class members, are these mechanical lubricators which supply oil to things like the axle boxes and the actual pistons themselves. These are actually obscuring the builder's plate, which so there you can see Great Northern Railway, Doncaster 1898, order number 769. Here we have a few oil pots as well for other lubricating other bits of the locomotive as well. So these are the slide bars which support the crosshead, and the motion of the crosshead is transmitted to the connecting rod, which connects the action going on in the cylinders with the rear driving wheel. And this in turn is coupled via the coupling rod, which is obscured by the connecting rod, to the front driving wheel, as you can see here, and you can see sort of the lubrication points there on top of of the connecting rods. The wheelbase is very, very, very narrow, and considering you're bowling along the East Coast main line, they wouldn't have really stabilised the locomotive in quite the same way as a Pacific would, as 3 sets of driving wheels would have done. Particularly as this rear axle here, although it allowed a greater side play as you're going around curves on the main line, it reportedly didn't have any side control. So that kind of meant that there was very little counteracting the movement along the rail. So these locomotives would have probably waddled and have been quite uncomfortable when they were bowling along. Here we can see the mechanism for the reverser. These holes here are what's known as boiler washout plugs. So when you want to clean the boiler out, you insert your hoses and wash the water through, flush out all your dirt and grime that's accumulated over the period of steaming. Here we have one of the nameplates, Henry, and above the nameplate is another oiling point. And here we have Oakley, and again there's yet another oiling point above it. Moving on towards the front of the boiler, so there you see the chimney, and then just behind the chimney you can see the snifting valve. Now it is an anti-vacuum valve which prevents a vacuum from forming inside the cylinder when the drivers actually shut the steam off when coasting. This locomotive in 1922 was modified by Ivett's successor, none other than Nigel Gresley, and he added superheating, and essentially the superheater header actually redirected the steam through the boiler for a second time, producing superheated steam, which was then routed into the cylinders. It is more fuel efficient and more economical in terms of water use. Up here you can see the locomotive dome, which contains the regulator. Before Ivett became locomotive superintendent of the Great Northern Railway, they tended not to go for regulators in domes. They tended to rely on a greater amount of space above the firebox to put their regulator valve in. But Ivett decided to put a high point on the boiler and actually put the regulator valve inside that. This actually meant that the locomotive was less prone to water carryover, which means water from the boiler carrying over into the valve, and again causing the problems in the cylinders. Moving further back again, we have here the Ramsbottom design of safety valves. They're all spring loaded. You can see the whistle up top there and the cab spectacle plate. It's quite a brutally plain cab actually. It's very, very reminiscent of Patrick Stirling's cabs. Here you can also see the eye shields, which allowed the driver to peer out of the side of the cab with relative safety. If you can imagine the ash actually flowing out of the chimney at speed. And then here we have the door onto the footplate, which is kind of hinged. You lift the door out of a little groove and actually close it by dropping it into another groove. So this is the tender water tank, carried 3,600 gallons of water, and the coal bunker actually carried 5 tons of coal, and you can see some of the coal rails up here which helped add a bit of extra capacity. And then here the sort of tender axle boxes. You can kind of see the suspension here. You can also see the oil pots for adding oil to the pads inside the axle boxes. And then sort of you got some outside brake rigging around here for the tender brakes. And then through this slot here you can kind of see the water scoop, which is controlled by the lever from the tender to collect water on the move without stopping. You had to judge the use of the water scoop quite well as a crew person, because if your tender was already pretty full of water, the water would have a rather nasty habit of soaking the first few carriages of the train. So it's probably best not to have your packed lunch and a window open at that point in time. So moving further towards the rear, here we have the guard irons which protect the wheels from any obstructions which are on the track. Here you have the buffers, important. Again you've got lamp brackets on the rear of the tender. Again you have the vacuum brake hose. So there you have it. That's a bimble around Henry Oakley and charting some of its differences from when it was built in 1898. This locomotive kind of represents sort of the transition point in British locomotive design. From your small sort of mid to late Victorian 440 and actually trying to create something a lot bigger, a lot more powerful and a lot more capable of actually hauling ever faster and heavier express trains. So essentially Henry Oakley was kind of the beginning. It wasn't the finished product. There's a lot of development to go before you reach things like Flying Scotsman and Mallard, but it was kind of pointing in the direction of bigger is better when you want to run faster and longer trains and heavier trains. So if you enjoyed our wander around Henry Oakley, why not like this video and subscribe to the channel, and thanks very much.